Before we get started, I'm so curious, oftentimes at these webinars, people will say, well, where are you calling in from? Drop it in the chat. Instead of asking where are you calling in from, I'm curious, what is the worst icebreaker question you've gotten at a webinar? Is there something that you've received? You're like, oh my God, not this question again. If you can drop into the chat, I'd love to hear it. So we never, ever ask that of people who join the webinar.
That's a very good question.
Calling in from is a good one, but it's definitely,
It's overused. I feel like every webinar I go in, it's like, oh, let me know where you're from. Put it in the chat,
Exactly.
Okay. So I see 2:02 on my time. I don't know if she gets. Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Do it.
So I want to welcome everyone who's actually on time for the webinar. We really appreciate your punctuality. As you know, today's topic is going to be on burnout, but it's going to be a bit of a different take on it. Hopefully, you come away with some really interesting insights and some learnings. The webinar is recorded, so if you are joining late, don't worry. You can always pick it up from where you left off. And you'll get a recording, obviously, at the end. That's standard fare kind of thing. So let's start by meeting who we are. Why should you hear from us? So I'm David. I'm the marketing manager at Vacation Tracker. And I'm not just the presenter here. I'm also a burnout survivor. There was a role, I won't name the company. I'm not going to shame them here, but in a previous role where I felt the effects of burnout. I was miserable, dreading the day going into work. At one point I was like, how much longer can I last? And it just, at a certain point, things need to change. And I realized that, but I definitely took way too long to figure that out. And sure enough, I had left on unfavorable terms, but I'm here. I'm stronger for it. So I'm happy to be presenting. What about you, Una?
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. My name is Una. I work at HeyTaco, and at HeyTaco, I work with a lot of our customers who are using recognition and giving recognition every single day. Burnout survivor. I'm not, I feel like it's sometimes too chronic, right? Like having chronic experiences of burnout, mostly by being always on, right, or not disconnecting from whether it's school or work or family, whatever the stimulants are. It's hard to sometimes take a break. So I definitely suffer from that from time to time. Very excited to be here with you. If you can't hear us, please drop it in the chat. We're just operating under the assumption that you can hear us.
Good point.
Exactly. As David said, this webinar will be recorded. You'll receive a recording shortly afterwards. If you want to share your questions or ask questions throughout the presentation, please drop them in the chat or Q&A, either or. We'll monitor them. We might answer them at the end, or we might just answer them in real time, but they will be answered. So please engage with us. The value of doing this live with a bunch of people in the room is that you get to hear what everyone else is saying, not just what David and I have to say. So please drop your things that have worked for you or things that haven't worked for you. Any tips and advice that you have from everyone else in this room will always be super valuable. In terms of what's on the agenda for today, 3 main parts. The first one is recapping what is burnout. We might all kind of know what it is, but we might not actually have clear ideas, at least even before we talked about this webinar. I definitely had some things I didn't know. So a lot of times this is just about repeating things so we can make sure that we stay on top of it. We'll talk about some common burnout myths or facts and how they connect to addressing burnout in yourself and your team, your teams that you're leading, and then some practical tips on how to combat burnout. And it won't just be like take some time off. David has compiled an amazing list of actually free resources you can just share with your team and your collaboration channels and give them some free goodies to fight burnout towards the end of the year. And then we'll dive into some Q&As at the end, any thoughts or reflections. 2 main takeaways we hope you leave with today is understanding how do you recognize different types of burnout, and then how do you combat it, right? So hopefully you can leave with one of those tips today that just makes it easier for you to lead your teams and prepare them for ending 2024 strong and then getting into 2025 on a good note. So without further ado, David, you mind jumping into the Burnout 101?
Of course. And thank you for setting the stage, I think. So Burnout 101, like Una was saying, we're just going to kind of give everyone a base level understanding. I think most people know what the term means, but they don't really know the true meaning behind it, how it came about, or Like what is it? What does it mean when I say I'm burnt out? I'm done, you know? So let's go back to the beginning. Let's break it down. This was actually created, I didn't know this, in the 1970s by an American psychologist. Originally, the intended use for it was for caregiving professionals, right? People who work extremely long hours, a very tough job for sure. And it was only in, let's say, recent years where it kind of gained more notoriety, especially as, you know, things have evolved in the world. And the World Health Organization actually defines it as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. The one thing I do want to note, a lot of people seem to think it's a medical condition. At this time, unless new research has come out, it is not classified as such. Most people tend to call it an occupational phenomenon. Um, you know, and that's really what it kind of encapsulates. Now, burnout itself, again, very flashy term. People say I'm burnt out, like I just said it before, but people don't seem to really understand the costs behind burnout, especially if you're working at a company, whether you're an owner or an admin or work in HR, or even just as a fellow employee. You know, it does take its toll. Look, some of these statistics I pulled out from Gallup was really eye-opening for me. You know, some of the percentages about people more likely to take a sick day, go into the emergency room. And again, I'm just a marketing manager, but imagine my teammate, you know, is leaving very often, needs to take more sick days. That affects, you know, team composition, the workload. So it can have an impact on you as well. And just other stuff like you see towards the bottom here, like half is likely to discuss how to approach performance goals with their manager. So that means you're not having employees who want to grow within your company or grow within your organization, employees who want to be high performers. Very, very scary statistics to say the least. Some common causes. You can see here, these are not all of them, but just a few that I thought were really interesting. Things like, you know, unfair treatment, unmanageable workload, but just some other ones that maybe don't seem as apparent when you're talking about burnout, like boring or routine work, you know, people who just kind of apathetic, punching in, punching out, or maybe unclear job expectations, like you're not sure what's going on, or lack of communication. So again, it's not necessarily confined to those big flashy things where it's like a salesperson goes on burnout. There's all sorts of factors that are at play here. But I don't know, like, is there an easy way to tell, Una, how someone can be burnt out? You tell me. I think you know.
What a great segue. I do have to touch on one of the statistics you had on the
For
slide,
sure.
David,
Let
which
me go
I think
back.
to me is the most fascinating one, which is that people are half as likely to discuss how to
Yeah,
approach performance goals with their manager. I think it's a little scary to me. Like if people are half as likely to discuss performance goals, what else are they half as likely to
right.
discuss, right? Their fit within the company, their future with the company, how they progress, how they feel around their colleagues. That's the basis of a lot of our companies, is having those one-on-one relationships and connections with people around us. And if people don't want to talk, it's really, really hard to build a culture and build a bridge towards them if they're not opening. So I just had to highlight that. That was, I think you and I learned a lot preparing for this
Yeah.
webinar. And to me, this was a statistics that definitely opened my eyes about how important it is to address burnout early and often. In terms of, you know, when you're burned out, when, I'd love if you can drop it in the chat of when do you know when someone's burned out? Or when do you know when you're burned out? If you can finish this sentence and just share tips and things you have seen in people on your team about how do you know when someone's burned out when. David, while people are, when you quickly about upset by anything, oh, that's so true. David, what do you think? How do you know when someone's burned out? Do you have any, or how do you know when you're burned out?
Oh, for me, it's simple as I'm not as, let's say, participating in conversations, checked out, more quiet, as you can tell. I don't know if you guys can tell through the webinar, but I tend to be a very loud person. So hopefully it's not coming across too much in this recording and you don't have to lower your volume too much. But if you start seeing like opposite trends in my behavior, then that's a telltale sign, I would say. What about you, Una?
Definitely noticing the differences. I love, for me, it's getting irritable for sure. Right. When I feel like my reaction time is shorter and I can react quickly to my family, my colleagues, right, my friends. Oftentimes, you know, having a thought between the stimulus and response is good. And when I'm burnt out, I think there's less time for me to control my reaction. I love what people were saying about, there's in the chat, there's a lot of behavior things you can notice are people getting irritable, losing focus, they can't concentrate, they can't get work done. Another thing that people are sharing in the chat is words that people use, like Jasmine said, they say they just need to make it through the week. And that's something to
Yeah.
watch for, is behaviors,
Yeah.
right? How do people react? What is their state? But also, what are the words that they're saying? They might say, I really don't feel appreciated, or I can't wait for the weekend, or I just don't have time to relax, or I don't have time to do all those things. These are all signs to watch for when you're working with colleagues, your teammates, and be like, okay, maybe this is something to act on. There was another thing in the chat. Quinn shared they no longer express belief in their ability to affect change in the workplace. Quinn, that's a very interesting one that we'll touch on when we talk about the different types of burnout. That was very interesting research we found about this not inefficacy, in a sense, feeling like I can't affect the workplace I'm surrounded with.
Yeah.
Before we go into that, we compiled a list of some burnout myths and facts. So let's jump into that, David. What do you think?
Yeah. I think that the timing is right.
By the way, I just have to declare, like, David and I were thinking about what do we do on these slides that is fun. And since we are from Vacation Tracker and HeyTaco, the natural combination was to have a taco and a vacation in the background of the slides. In case that didn't stand out, I just had to appreciate it because David created a really amazing taco and a vacation.
I can't take all the credit. As you know, AI is pervasive in all facets of life. So when it came to needing an image, just entered a prompt, and honestly, I think it came out pretty well, minus the taco fillings be multicolored. Again, if I saw a taco like that, I would hesitate, but I
It
thought it
looks
was
great here. Looks great
yeah.
here.
All right. So let's dive into the first myth or fact, shall we, Una?
Let's do it.
Burnout and stress are the same. So as part of this portion, we also want you guys to participate. And I don't know, should we do thumbs up, thumbs down? Should we do yes or no in the chat? What are we feeling?
Let's do yes or no, or thumbs up and thumbs down. Maya
Perfect. Whatever
says
you guys feel
no.
comfortable with. How about that? This is a good way to self-test your own knowledge and see how well do you actually know burnout. So do we think burnout and stress are the same? All right, gain some
People are
no's.
saying no. I'm going to admit my own ignorance. I thought I use them interchangeably. Maybe I didn't really consciously think if they're the same, but I totally use them interchangeably.
Yeah. So as Una has said, it is a myth. They are not the same. Although to be clear, stress can be a cause of burnout. It's not the only cause. I found this great kind of reference point showing, okay, what does it mean when you're stressed versus when you're burned out? I also put these two little, I guess, worker images together, which I thought were very cute. But basically, when you're stressed, right, your emotions might be more heightened, you're more active, anxious, and your work, there's such a thing as good stress, right, where your work seems meaningful. Like, yeah, there's a lot of work, but I'm accomplishing a lot. Versus when you're more burned out, your emotions might be more dull. You might be more withdrawn into yourself, kind of like the stuff I was saying, where I'm not really participating as much. You feel low. I think so. I might have seen this in the chat as well, but your work seems more meaningless than usual. You just feel like, again, punching in, punching out, trying to just survive till the end of the week. So again, just because someone's stressed doesn't mean that they're burnt out. It just means it could mean it, I guess is a better way to put it. So I want to say congratulations to all who got it right. I think that's most of us, maybe minus Una and myself, because I also fell for that originally. So kudos to you. You're already one step ahead of us. But let's see if they can keep it going in the next myth or fact.
The second one is burnout is all about exhaustion. True or false? Thumbs up or thumbs down? In a sense of it's only when you're like, oh, I just don't have the energy. I'm done. That's what it means to be burned out. Maya says no.
Got a few no's, another few thumbs down. Ooh.
Yes. Couple, kind of. Yeah. Nice. This was definitely a fun one that throughout our research we discovered and wanted to bring to you as just hopefully an insight that helps you frame how do you recognize and deal with burnout. So actually, burnout is not all about exhaustion. There's three components of burnout. There's a study by two authors, Later and Maslach. They were university researchers in Australia who researched what are the different components of burnout. And I'm not an academic, so I won't bore you with the details of the study. I don't think I can do them justice. I believe we share them in the resources with the slide deck, so you'll get to read the actual paper if you'd like. What they found is that there are actually three components of burnout. The first one is exhaustion. It's what we associate with being physically depleted. The second one is inefficacy, which is connected to not doing as much that
Mm,
we're used to, right? Like reduced productivity. And then cynicism. And this is a lot what Quinn mentioned earlier, which is not feeling, connected to not the feeling of inefficacy is like depersonalizing. It's me versus the company, right? Or me
mm,
versus whoever else. So exhaustion mostly characterized by being worn out, not really having energy, being depleted, tired. You're like, I just need to take time off. Like, I'm just exhausted. You show up to work tired, you're not sleeping well, all that stuff. And probably a lot of the irritability and responding to people very quickly without thought, without being calm is probably connected to exhaustion, right? When we don't get enough rest and sleep, it's really hard to function. Inefficacy is all connected to something that used to take me an hour now takes 5, right? So I'm not feeling as productive. I'm probably not feeling as accomplished as a result. My morale's a little bit low. I feel like everything is doom and gloom. It's hard for me to cope with things that usually are easy for me to cope with. Like maybe I get bad feedback or constructive feedback from my manager, and usually I'm really good at handling it and understanding how
mm,
do I translate it into my increased performance. But right now it just feels like I'm about to get fired, right? I'm having a hard time coping with that
right.
situation. And then reduced capability to do certain work. Again, this is probably how I noticed a lot of my burnout is it takes me an hour to do something that could have been a 5-minute task. I'm like, oh, maybe I should take a break because this is clearly I'm not being productive right now. And then the third one is cynicism. And how you notice that is that people feel, again, depersonalization from the company, right? From their team. It feels like us versus them, me versus them. They're withdrawing from their work. Maybe it's not just not showing up to meetings, but maybe they used to be very proactive about taking on certain tasks and they're not doing that anymore, right? It's kind of like, it's my job. I'm going to clock out and I'm not going to go above and beyond, or I'm not even going to do things that I used to be able to do. Irritability, right? Just reacting to people very quickly without pausing. And then loss of idealism. I
Mm,
think most of us can connect with the feeling of starting a new job and being very excited. I hope, at least, like
yeah.
if you're going to feel idealistic about a job, the first month is probably the time. And then slowly we start losing that idealism and we feel like, this is not what I thought it would be. Maybe oftentimes we're not even conscious that that's actually what's happening. But from the start of the job to 6 months into a year in, we feel less and less idealistic and excited about the company and direction and whatnot. And we'll talk about how to combat each of those and how do you address it. But these are the 3 components that just as you're working with your team in one-on-one capabilities, or you're seeing group chats or conversations, just notice, what are you seeing, right? Because
Mm.
if you can't understand where the burnout is coming from, it's really hard to address it with proper mechanisms. David, what's our third myth or fact?
Burnout is directly correlated with work. Now, I feel like we may have given away the answer at certain points, but maybe not. Maybe it was all a trick. I'm curious to see what you guys think. Do you think it's correlated with work? Do you think there's absolutely no correlation?
I feel like it isn't. I've definitely remember being very burnt out in school, right?
Mm.
Or when playing sports, you're like, oh, I can't do this
Is
anymore.
that
So I feel
burnout?
like,
Well,
yeah, that's a great question, but I feel like it's not just work related. I think you can get burned out in a lot of different categories. Mike, that's kind of what I
yeah.
think.
All right. Well, you are correct. I guess my trying to convince people that it is directly correlated did not work. So you can see I'm not an actor, even as much as I try. But as most of you guess, yeah, it can happen anywhere. Like Una was saying, I think the discussion around burnout tends to happen a lot because of a lot of times it is due to work, but there's all kinds of burnout. Like you saw at the beginning when I was explaining the origins, it came from caregivers. That's not just hospital workers, it's people who are caregivers for their own families in their own homes. There's parental caregiver, for your kids. There's marital, sorry, not caregiver, parental burnout, excuse me. And then marital burnout as well, like, with your partner or your spouse. There's all sorts of factors that kind of influence whether or not you'll feel burnt out. And on some level, there's some that you can't even control. Like you can see here in this diagram that I really like from Psychology Today. There's the micro level, which you have more control over. So that's, your work, your community, your family. But there's that macro level, right? Of things happening in the world or happening in society or happening in the politics they don't have a control over. And you need to understand that that's outside of your control. and try not to feel, I guess, impacted by it, and learn some techniques, which again we'll cover later on, but just to kind of get out of that state of mind where it kind of brings you down. So yeah, really, really was fascinated by this stuff. Even the stuff you're pointing out, Una, before, it was really eye-opening. I was telling Una in our prep sessions that some of the stuff, like, wow, like I thought I knew burnout, but some of these things like really, really resonate with me. So I was shocked.
One thing, David, that I recently heard a speaker mention at a conference I went to a couple weeks ago called CultureCon. They were talking about burnout and work-life balance. Like, it's a term we
Right.
all know. And at this company, I forgot what the name of the company was, but they don't think about work-life balance. They use the word headspace. Like, what headspace are people in? What occupies a headspace? And versus like, okay, now 9 to 5, you're at work and then you go home. But it's more about how do you help people manage their energy and manage what headspace they are in, because sometimes you deal with life stuff in the middle of work because it just happens, or work stuff in the middle of life because we work almost on the clock, especially if you're working
Right.
remotely. Like, it's harder to disconnect. But I thought the word headspace and focusing on where's your headspace was an interesting reframing of work-life balance.
Yeah. I also do think work-life balance is starting to get a bit more like overused as well as a term. A previous let's say mentor of mine, she was a firm believer in work-life integration because she's one of those people who can't shut off, but she found a schedule where, okay, yeah, I might be working like longer hours, but it's more spread out. I'm not doing intense, deep focus work for 8 hours a day. Maybe I'm doing, more laid back kind of work over the course of 10 hours, but that's what worked for her. Like, she enjoyed that versus some people, like you said, who want more of a balance. Like, I want to do all my work up front and then have my personal time afterwards. So it's, it's whatever works for you. But I like the term headspace. That makes so much sense because you don't just shut off. It's with you.
Exactly. We're always on. Our mind is always on. So what is it focused on at this time?
Yeah. All right. Shall we dive into the next myth or
Do
fact?
it. Burnout is not binary. It exists on a continuum. What do you guys think? Is that a true or false, myth or a fact?
Maybe you can elaborate what that means as well, Una. So
Yeah,
people.
binary. What I mean by binary, or what we mean by binary is it's either you're burned out or you're not burned out, right? So it's not binary. It's like, oh, it's not just burnt out or not burnt out. There's a spectrum in between, right? There's a continuum in between that is not just I'm burned out or I'm not.
Gotcha.
And this is where I thought it was just like, oh, I'm burned out or I'm not burned out. Like, what does it mean to be 30% burned out? But it turns out that this is actually a fact. It's not binary and exists on a continuum. And this is a chart from the research study that I mentioned before that I'll walk you through. But what the researchers found that they're based on the 3 components of burnout: exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy, or in this case, inefficacy, right? When I'm low on efficacy, I'm actually inefficient. There are a few different burnout profiles. And what I found interesting is that when you're high on all 3, exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy, you're burned out, right? That's kind of the 100. If you go from 0 to 1, that's the 1. If you're only high on exhaustion, you're actually overextended, right? You just might have way too much on your plate, your workload's too high, you're working too much, and you just don't have time to get everything done. If you're high on cynicism, or the highest on cynicism, but lower on exhaustion and inefficacy, you're actually disengaged. So a lot of times in the circles that we all operate in people leadership, HR leadership, we talk a lot about employee engagement and disengagement. And this is one thing that causes that disengagement, is this cynicism, right? The depersonalization, the withdrawal, the us versus them, not belief in the company, loss of idealism. And that's an interesting thing of, like, we'll talk about how do you actually affect that. And then when you're high on inefficacy, but you're low on all these other things, you're just ineffective, right? Not just, but you're ineffective in a sense of things that you used to be good at. You're just not feeling as accomplished. And probably everyone has that at some stage in their life. Professional athletes, artists, right? They're just not producing as much as they used to. And there's, Roger Federer took 6 months off of his career to focus on things and came back and won a major, right afterwards. So there's something to I'm just not feeling efficient right now, and I need to do something about that. And then engagement is the highest level. When you're low on exhaustion, you're not exhausted, you're not cynical, you're very engaged in your work, and you have high efficacy. You're at this kind of at the zero where we all want our teammates to ideally be, is to be engaged in their work and being in balance. And the reason this chart I thought was very, very interesting to share is because, again, you can see where is my team, right? If you're working with teams, especially smaller teams, if you're not leading, 200 people where you're not necessarily talking to 200 people, you can say, hey, if I work with 3 people, where do I think they fall in this category? You might even ask them certain questions, right? And say, hey, how do I help them address that? So very interesting concept of, based on those components, there's different burnout profiles, from engaged to burned out and everything in between.
Great. I love that sports analogy, by the way. As a sports person, that helps me kind of put into context.
6 months off in the middle of his career and came back strong, right? It's pretty amazing. I mean, a lot of academics take sabbaticals. A lot of bigger companies will offer sabbaticals after a certain milestone, like 5 years, 7 years, or whatever. And there's a reason people do that, right? It's Simone Biles. Yes, exactly. Right. Like what a great example that we just got to witness of how that worked out for her, right? Which was pretty good. So if these people needed, imagine like all of us, we're not in Olympic gold race, right? And it's still helpful to take that off. David, last but not least, what do we have for myth versus fact?
Also a great segue, talking about taking time off. So this was one that I also thought was interesting. A lot of discourse online, but taking time off is the only way to beat burnout. Be curious to see what you guys think. Again, maybe not as clear as you think. Maybe there's a trick here. I don't know. But we'll see.
It helps. Allison said it helps. It definitely helps, right? I don't think it ever hurt to take time off. Did anyone ever say, oh, I wish I hadn't taken that time off? Probably not. But
maybe like the owner of a company, like the CEO.
Yeah. Oh, now I have too many emails to catch up on, and kind of I'm taking myself out of a hole. Yeah, that could be the reason why people say, oh, maybe it's not. But yeah, I feel like if taking time off is the only way to be burnout, people would feel so refreshed for a really long time when they came back to work. And we all know, we have people, we've been those people. When you come back to work, you're like, oh, here it goes again, right? Or Sunday scaries. How many people experience Sunday scaries, right? You just took 2 days off, and then on Sunday evening, you're like, ugh, gotta go back to work.
Taylor, I gotta say, I love this concept of burnout buddies.
Yeah, that was great.
Kind of buddies in general, but this is great. A specific buddy for burnout. I love that. All right. We have some very good answers, some nuanced answers as well, which I appreciate. I think most of you got clued in. This is a myth. Taking time off doesn't always work, but I do want to elaborate, like what Una's saying. A long extended sabbatical can help, right? If you are addressing the root of the problem and you're really refocusing. But if you think taking a long weekend or taking a week off is going to solve the root cause of burnout, I think you're in for a surprise. This was a study I found that I thought was really interesting, where a lot of people who do take time off, you can see they typically almost re-experience burnout either immediately or within 1 week. There's a large percentage of them that have fallen into these two kind of buckets, where it's kind of scary, right? Like you just think, oh yeah, I'm going to take a longer week. I just need to clear my head, using the term headspace again there. And then next thing you know, you're back at work and it's the same problems persisting, whether it's, you don't feel connected to the role, or you're confused about the role, or the workload's too much. And take this from someone who actually works. Our company is called Vacation Tracker, and we deal with paid time off. Again, great thing to have, and a great, opportunity. Like we were saying, no one's going to turn down more time off. But I think giving the typical mental health day or mental health week to your employees, like I know some companies do that, might not always address the root cause. You really got to talk to your employees, have that conversation with them, and get to the root cause of it. And I think most people have been waiting for this section the most, but how do we combat burnout, right? We're talking a lot about what causes it, what to look for, some myths and some facts, but if you do notice, let's say you see that one employee in your organization, how do we solve this problem, right? How do we get to the root cause? So like Una was saying, there's those 3 components we have, right? Exhaustion, inefficacy, and cynicism. Taking a closer look at exhaustion, that is when you're really wiped out, whether it's emotionally, physically. cognitively, or even all three, right? There's no limit. You could be exhausted on all fronts to a point where any sort of extended rest, sleep, again, vacation doesn't really replenish, doesn't recharge your batteries. Here's, I don't want to say this is the end all be all list of how you can address it. These are some great kind of concepts, again, that are really important. I saw a few in the chat, right? Encouraging time off. So like that burnout buddies comment, that's fantastic. Get someone who can help you, push you to take more time off, especially when you have it. There's an alarming amount of statistics where employees at companies who have their paid time off just don't use it. Even though they do get paid out at the end of the year, there's no reason for them not to take a bit of time to reset themselves, creating that better work-life balance by trying to promote more daily breaks, especially if you're in a position like a managerial position or above, where you can encourage your employees to do so. That's always a great thing and always respected by employees. Reassessing workloads. Just because you create a plan, at the beginning of 2024, I know now we're going to 2025, it's a bit late, but when you do create your plans for 2025, there's nothing wrong with reassessing that plan partway through the year, whether it's the first quarter, the first half, and seeing if it makes sense, seeing if the workload is too much for your employees or even too little. There's potential opportunity there as well. And of course, setting achievable goals, right? No one wants to, one of the worst feelings I know for myself personally is when we have a goal and we don't achieve it, especially if it's just too far out of reach, asking your employees to triple sales or, to reduce, amount of time spent on tasks by like 50%. Sometimes it's a larger mountain, I think setting something that's, not necessarily too easy, but achievable, or something that's within the range of, I can do this and I'll feel good about it, I think is one of the better ways for sure you can combat exhaustion. Again, keep them motivated throughout the whole time. That's just one component though. I'm going to pass it back to Una now, who's going to take it away for the next component that we have.
David, one thing I thought I've heard people do, especially when it comes to exhaustion and promoting people taking time off, is asking people how their vacation was. Say, send us photos, or what's the greatest thing you've cooked on your staycation? Like, it doesn't have to be anything crazy, but just encouraging people to share back little things, right? To show, hey, yeah, it's okay to take vacation, especially if you have unlimited PTO and people might be kind of leery of, I don't want to do too much, but just asking those questions and have people report back. Okay, cynicism. So as we talk, cynicism is feeling detached from the job, the company, right? Just depersonalization, maybe negative attitude of like, oh, this place sucks, right? Or like, I don't think we're doing that well. Detached concern, you're just not worried. You truly just don't care. Maybe that's the shortest phrase that's very like layman, is you just don't care. A few things that could help address it is, first of all, having one-on-one conversations with the person, whether you're their manager or just their colleague, like someone who they trust, and say, hey, I've noticed this, like, what's happening? How are you doing as a person? Not trying to have an agenda of getting them to switch their mind, but just really, really, really trying to understand what they're going through and validate that. Like, you don't even have to try and coach it. Just really try and understand, be responsive, and validate what they're going through. Share appreciation for their work when applicable, right? Oftentimes we forget to say thank you, even though it's so simple, right? But you're like, oh, well, they already know I appreciate that, right? Or it's part of their job. Well, people still like to hear that. They still like to hear, hey, this was great, or I really appreciate how you did that. It also helps with another thing, which is helping those people feel seen, right? If I'm kind of withdrawing from the company, I'm probably also feeling like not important, people don't care about me. Just extending a hand and extending a thank you in small things would be super helpful. And then sharing the wider company or team strategy with them, how they fit in. So in order to create buying, a lot of times people disconnect from the company because they don't understand the why, right? They're getting translated objectives into KPIs or goals, and like, okay, so I have to do 30 demos this week, but I don't understand why. Like, what are we actually trying to accomplish as a company? When you share the why, a lot of times people will be okay with the what, because they understand why their work is feeding into the big picture. There's a really good book I recently read called Extreme Ownership, and it was by, I believe, a Navy veteran or Navy SEAL, where he talked about how do you build extreme ownership into people at all levels of the company. Like, they don't have to be in leadership or in position of authority, but where people really own the mission. And one of the key things he talked about is you got to share the why, right? If you just share the what, people are like, okay, whatever, we need to move, in the SEAL teams, we need to take this boat from the water and put it on this truck, it's like, okay, but why? Like, why are we doing that? What is the mission of this? What are we trying to accomplish? It really helps people connect of like, oh, this is why my work is important. No matter how meaningless the work might feel, when they understand the deeper why, people will feel a bit more connected.
Yeah. I'm noticing a theme of like transparency, right, throughout all these points.
Yeah.
I'm sure that was intentional as well, but it goes a long way, and it's a simple, it's a simple thing to do. Again, depending on your role within the company, for sure. If you're a lower level employee, it might not be as easy to have a one-on-one. But if you're again in a managerial position, like this is a small thing you can do, a small gesture.
Exactly. And then last but not least, combating inefficacy, right? So again, inefficacy is described as sense of lack of accomplishment, reduced productivity, capability, inability to cope. I'm just not feeling on top of my game necessarily. A few ways to help address it with those people that you're working with, or for yourself if you're the one feeling in those shoes, is going for the quick wins. We did at HeyTaco, we do a podcast with team leads and CEOs, and one of the greatest guests we had, they were all great guests, but this particular director of engineering, he was so thoughtful in how he approached building his engineering team at the startup company. And one thing he talked about building cohesion and his team is going for the quick wins, right?
Mhm.
Finding the quickest way for this team to achieve something awesome, ship code, right? Resolve a customer ticket or write a one pager on this particular thing. It doesn't have to be huge, but going for the quick win in a sense of a smaller goal and accomplishing it, right? That's how you build up the confidence for yourself, for your teammates. Sometimes the goals people have in front of them are so big
Yeah,
that they don't know how to get there, right? If we need to increase sales by 30%, that's a lagging indicator. It's not a leading indicator. What if I just need to call 10 people if I'm a sales rep? That's my goal for the day. Okay, I can call 10 people, right? Now there's something manageable in front of you to do. The second thing is focusing on one task at a time, which is very connected to not being always on and muting notifications, right? Even if you're working in a distributed way, hybrid, it means that half of your time is spent online. And we all kind of become slaves to our collaboration tools, whether you're using Microsoft Teams or Google Chat or Slack. And we feel like we always have to respond to the person asking us questions in real time. And sometimes we do, right? Sometimes that's the expectation of the team. And I encourage you as team leads and managers to think about, am I setting that expectation even unwillingly? Is it just an unspoken rule that when someone pings you, you have to respond right away? Because unless it's urgent, a lot of times the context switching or whatever the person's working on takes time, right? And it's harder for them to focus. It's even harder for them to get into that productive flow. So focusing on one task at a time and not expecting this always on mentality of what kind of permeates remote work and online work. And then similar to what Taylor shared about burnout buddies, get an accountability partner, right? Maybe share a goal with your colleague and say, hey, today, or my goal by the end of the week is to do X, Y, Z. And I'm going to tell you on Friday whether I did it or not. There's nothing more powerful than setting your goals out into the universe and not wanting to go back on your word or say, actually, I didn't do it, right? So sometimes we can use that trick even on ourselves or with our teammates. Say, hey, can I be like, do you want me to help you with something? Maybe you share your accountability goal with them and say, do you want to share yours back? And maybe we can help each other out, right? A lot of, Weight Watchers as a weight loss tool program is built on that, on shared accountability amongst a group of people in a cohort coming together every Friday and saying, this is what I did this last week. So it's a very powerful tool when we're feeling a little bit just this sense of inefficacy. Before we go into the next thing, I just wanted to bring up Norman's question. So I'm going to read it out loud, David, in case you can't see it. But Norman said, what about doing this at the start of the week? Like my team does this thing. How was your weekend? Monday morning. People encouraged to share. And if they did something, share photos. Is this too good or too much? And this is related to where we talked about taking time off and encouraging people to take time off and say, hey, how was your vacation? What do you think, David? If on Monday morning, someone asks, hey, how was your weekend? People share, and then if they did something awesome, share photos. What do you think?
I like that. That's low stakes. You're not forced to share anything. It's not like going back to your original question where it's like you're forced to do these icebreaker questions and you want to seem like you're part of the team. It's much more open-ended. Anyone do something cool? Let's see some photos. And I think a lot of time too, it's just people are just genuinely interested, want to see what you've been up to. Especially in this world. I don't know, Norman, if you're at a remote or full in office, but little details like that matter to build that culture, to build that sense of community at the office. So I'm all for that.
Hybrid. One thing we do with our team is we work in person Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and Mondays we don't do any meetings. So we have a stand up every Thursday, Tuesday through Friday, excuse me, but no Mondays. And when we get together in person on Tuesday, we're excited to see each other. And before we do our regular stand up and weekly meeting, we'll say, okay, first we do a weekend stand up. And we go around the room and say, what'd you do this weekend? And it could be something fun as I cooked a pod roast for 3 hours, right? Like it doesn't have to be a great trip. It's just little things. And then that person might share their tips for cooking an amazing pot roast, right? Or I watched this football game. Did you see that? That was great. Little things like that. But we call it the weekend stand up and we do it before we dive into the regular work
I love
topics.
that. If
So
was the pot roast good? I don't know if someone had a good recipe, but I would love to. I'm trying
one
to
of our
learn
colleagues
pot roast.
he's a great chef. So I'm
Ooh,
sure it was a great pot roast.
yeah, love that. Well, I think that's also a great segue into the second to last portion, because we do want to leave time for questions. But of course, I'm a big fan of when you attend a webinar, you should get something out of it and not just a sales pitch, and that's not what the goal was today. Is I really wanted to impart on you knowledge about burnout, or the science to look for, how do you combat it, and of course, a few ready to share resources. So I compiled this. I scoured the internet. I did my best to find things that are free. There's nothing worse when you get like a resource that's paywalled. Again, there's oodles of articles, books, and of course, if that works for you or you think that's going to work for your team, I highly encourage that. But I figured this was like a healthy mix, So you see here we have a playlist of TED Talks that I found that was really interesting for someone. You can just share with them if they feel burned out. A meditation app that's completely free. And when I mean free, I mean no ads, no payment plans, nothing in your face. It's just an app to meditate. For the person who likes gadgets and like a physical item, maybe you want to have an office raffle and you want to give away some prizes. This is a really like just sleek looking Pomodoro timer. And for those of you who don't know what the Pomodoro method is, it's a very famous method where essentially you divide up your day into chunks. So you'll do, a chunk that's dedicated for work, and then you'll do a chunk that's dedicated for break. And after a certain amount of these chunks, at the end of it, you take a longer break. This is a timer that facilitates that and just looks nice on the desk. A podcast. I know everything nowadays is a podcast, so of course there's going to be a podcast about burnout. But I thought this was interesting because it's inspiring stories of people who have burnt out and have recovered from it. And then another thing I'll point out, I'm not going to read every line here. You're going to get these slides so you can go through it yourself. But this is the scientists that Una was talking about. They did a psychological self-evaluation test that anyone can do. It's a bit technical, but you can definitely share that with your team, and they could self-assess. Am I starting to get those symptoms of burnout? Am I starting to trend that way? The last thing I also do want to stress is that this is just a starting point. There's for sure, so many resources out there. Like in my case, I know what works for me is I like to go outside often, so I'll take longer walks, especially during my lunch breaks to get fresh air, clear my head. Una, I know you had a great idea, and I'm going to bring that up again, that you guys did as a team that was really cool regarding the tasting. I won't reveal what it was, but I would love you to share it again.
Yeah, absolutely. I swear our team thought I was crazy when I brought this up. But again, we work hybrid, and for one team event, what we did is we had lunch as a team, paid for by the company, and then we did ice cream tasting around Alexandria, Virginia, which is where we work 2 days a week. And Alexandria, this is this cute, quaint colonial town outside of Washington D.C. And in a radius of 100 yards, there's like 6 ice cream stores. And we always wonder, how do they all stay in business? And which one's the best, right? How do you know? Because you don't want to waste your time with terrible ice cream. So we did an ice cream tasting trip. We took an hour and we each picked a flavor of ice cream. We actually chose 4 flavors at each place. And we went to each of those stores. We tried, pumpkin, chocolate, sea salt, caramel, and I forgot what the 4th one was. And then we had a whole rubric, just a Word doc that you can create with different categories. And we ranked and stacked those. And then we compared notes and flavors, kind of like, sommeliers for wine, but for ice cream. And we all agreed on one ice cream spot that was fun. It literally cost, tens of dollars, like a couple $100 or something like that. Nothing too crazy. But if you're remote, a version of that could be Have everyone buy a pack of Oreos, 3 different flavors of Oreos, and try
Love that.
Oreos, or gummy bears. I don't even know, something cheap and silly that just takes the mind off of just regular work and the stress of
Yeah.
the projects you're working on. So a lot of, you can do things as a team as well. And David, in terms of like these resources, which I thought were awesome, I was thinking about what would I do with that? Like how would I share that with our team? And I thought it could be fun to, the playlist of TED Talks is great. Find one and send it into your general channel and say, hey everyone, found a great talk. I'm gonna watch it. And if you want to have a cup of coffee and talk about it, let me
Yeah.
know. Or maybe share a resource with the person that you know is experiencing um, some sort of symptoms of burnout and say, hey, I saw this. Do you want to listen to this podcast together and then chat about it? Right. Or like, hey, I noticed this. Do you like encourage people, share things with people that you think might benefit them?
Love that. Also, I'll make this clear now. You guys are totally free to rip this off, pretend like you came up with these ideas, kind of like Una was saying. I know some companies sometimes do an internal newsletter. At a previous role I was working at, they would send one once a month, and it was about like tips, again, for things in the office, for self-reflection. So feel free to just rip this off, pretend like you came up with it. Like, yeah, I found these like Greek resources. I did the research.
Mm-hmm.
What's important is that it gets in the hands of the people who want to see it,
Mm-hmm.
who need the help, right? But that's another great segue. Again, or just yeah, picking one and sticking with it. Like the Nike Run Club, try to see if there's a lot of runners. I know more and more of a popular sport. I don't like running, but I know a lot of people do. And that's an easy, we do this together. The app tracks it. You guys, like, I guess, measure your times against each other. It could be kind of cool. I don't know.
Yeah. Exactly. In my last company, we did a bike to work month, and then
Oh my gosh.
people compared. We were all in person. It was pre-COVID.
Yeah,
We compared how many miles everyone biked that month, and then the person that biked the most got like free bike tune-up. Whatever, something silly. It doesn't
yeah,
have to be huge, but it created a really good camaraderie around the biking community, commuting community around
yeah.
work.
I love that.
David, we have some fun questions in the chat, so I'm going to read them out loud so we can address them. First question is, do you have any insights or reflections on the impact of remote, in-person, or hybrid work models on employee well-being, i.e. burnout?
Yeah.
What do you think, David? Anything that stands out?
Yeah. Well, so listen, having gone through the gauntlet of all three of those, being in person, hybrid, and now I'm fully remote, for sure, there's a bit of a give and take, and some things are better than, let's say, like if I'm remote, obviously I have much more control over my schedule. As an employee, I feel more productive. That's more me. But you do lose, again, that person-to-person touch. You don't feel as familiar. When it comes to, let's say, the focus of burnout, right? Um, those still same problems can persist. You can still have, much higher workloads because people expect you to perform at a higher level. Those touch points are lower, so you don't have. It's not as easy to throw a lifeline. Like in a previous role, I could just walk into my boss's office, but here it's like, okay, I have to message them on Teams or Slack, find an available time, try to talk to them. So it's a bit more, let's say, awkward on that front. But again, it comes out to the same thing. You want to address those three components of burnout, right? Find out what works, try
Mhm.
to see what can help out others. It's like I said, the symptoms are still there, but it takes a different shape, I guess is a better way to put it. I don't know, Una, if you
Mhm.
want to add to that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I often think more about the work model is it's a mechanism, right? We work remotely or in
Yeah,
person, but you can feel burnt out in person, you can feel burnt out remotely.
yeah,
I would encourage thinking about the 3 levels, definitely the 3 components of
yeah,
burnout, but also even ahead of that, thinking about what are the assumptions you have on your team about work and how work is done. What are the principles that you have at play? I'm not thinking necessarily about company values, but
right.
unspoken principles around we all work until 5, right? Or assumption
Mm,
we all start at 8:30, and maybe you want to write those down and have them come to consciousness for everyone and then say, is this how we want to operate? Because right now it's causing all of us to feel like we're always on, and that's affecting burnout. So thinking about what are the unspoken assumptions and rules that everyone kind of agrees on, but they've never really been consciously brought up. That's one thing that I would just encourage people to address, regardless of what the workplace environment is or work model.
yeah.
Another question is, any specific tips regarding fully remote working environments, especially when time is tracked, so there's not a
Mm,
lot of flexibility to take breaks? It can feel isolating at times, and we had a co-working Google Meet, but they kind of fell off. So Kimberly is wondering, is there any ideas on how to combat this that come to mind? Um, And I love Stephanie answered. She said they work remotely and have a fit club where people set goals, have raffles, share stories, offer support. One thing, Kimberly, I would recommend is thinking about asynchronous ways for people to connect and take a break at their own time, right? So maybe if you're working, the time is tracked, if you're in support or consulting or whatever, if you have a few minutes in between things, being able to jump into the Teams channel or Slack channel, and what do you jump to? Where's that spot where they can jump to that makes them feel like they're taking break, they're connecting, right? And it could be, I know there's different, for example, you can ask a prompt every single day. It's like, hey, what are you cooking for dinner this week? Not even maybe every day, every week, but like, or pet channels. I know people love pet channels in Teams and Slack. Is like share photos of your pets or share photos of your meals, right? Creating little kind of break rooms like that, virtual break rooms where people can go and contribute asynchronously when they have time to do that.
I love that.
David, what do you think?
So I know it seems like I have a lot of experience, but this is actual very poignant. I did work at an agency once where everything was tracked similar. We had a tool just for tracking every minute. For sure, there was a bit of a disconnect there, but I think the way that we combated it was similar to what Una was saying. We had created a bunch of Slack channels depending on your interests. So there's one for sports, one for, let's say, just pets, one for video games, one for movies. And like I said, when you have a minute, you can chime into the conversation, feel like a part of it. We also did once a week, kind of like a 5 cassette, but it was more like, it was more company wide, and it was also, we were able to start earlier. It wasn't at 5, it was at 4:30 to encourage people to, hey, like close down for your day. Another thing I also like there as well, when it was okay, yeah, you have to track your hours, but you don't have to do them like, you don't have to do 8 hours in a row. You can start, let's say, earlier in the morning, do a few hours, take your breaks then. It was more about getting the work done rather than having that set of hours that you worked. So finding creative ways. Again, it depends on the situation you're in. For sure, I think if you don't have a lot of control or say on how the day is comprised of, and I think asynchronous is the way to go, or finding those mandatory breaks where like lunchtime is a great opportunity as well. They also did like these kind of like coffee chats at lunch where it's like people would be encouraged to come. They do a little raffle, maybe a little quiz, a little trivia that was not related to work. It was just more pop culture, and that was just a fun way to engage in dialogue. Talk with people you don't normally talk with.
Mm-hmm. David, one related question from Kimberly, and then we'll dive into Norman's question, which is how do you fight the always-on mentality of full remote work, which contributes to burnout, especially with a global team, people reaching out at all hours and feeling like you have to answer? Oh, Kimberly, that's definitely a cultural shift and a team behavior shift to not expect always a response instantaneously and not feel like you have to give it. I'm curious, David, what you have to say. One thing I would share is, again, is acknowledging like, hey, this is how we're acting right now. Is this what we want to be doing? Because a lot of times this just comes as a result of the company getting started and it never got talked, and it just becomes the behavior that's expected, but it's not necessarily conscious, right? People don't want to be doing it. So addressing this with the leadership and saying, hey, this is what people are experiencing. I know because I talked to them. Is this how we want to act? And if it is, okay, well, might not be productive. It contributes to burnout. You can think about different ways to address burnout, right? But think most likely they'll say, well, not like we don't want to do that. If people are not feeling, if they're feeling burned out and not productive, we should definitely address that. And then working with your team and working with individuals, encouraging individuals to, you don't have to respond, right? And with team leads, hey, it's okay to not get a response right away. One thing I would also recommend, this is very tactical, block your calendar, right? Block your calendar and say, hey, right now I'm doing this and I'm unable to respond because I'm taking care of this customer, like I'm working customer support or I'm working this, but I'll respond to you, kind of setting expectations with the person or people that are pinging you all the time. David, what would you add or subtract?
Definitely not subtracting anything. I think that was well put. The only thing I will mention is because I also feel very what's it called, like empathetic towards this question, because I'm one of those people who also has a tough time shutting off. And I think the issue is I noticed that it's like, oh, it's like an easy answer, even though it's like 6 o'clock or whatever time it is past the work hours, like I can answer this in like 2 seconds. But it starts with you. If you keep doing that, then it kind of follows suit and it kind of permeates throughout that culture that everyone kind of feels the same way. Even if like the owner of the company or the CEO is like, no, like I'm answering this because that's how I work, but don't operate like that. It still kind of starts to become contagious. So pro tip that I've been doing more and more is scheduling things. So even though I'll answer it now, I'll schedule to go out at a time when it's working hours. So I still feel like, okay, I did what I want to do, but it's helping maintain that trend of like, okay, I'm only going to answer during working hours, even though I did let's say the
Mhm.
legwork. Obviously, if it's a very complicated question, then I don't recommend this tactic because you're going to still eat away at your own time. But if it's like, hey, like a quick answer, schedule it. Best thing. And that works for emails, Teams, Slack, whatever you're doing.
That's a really good tip, especially if it's not urgent, right? If it's
Yeah.
really urgent, yeah, deal with it in the moment. But most things
Yeah.
are not on fire, right? Most things are can be dealt with at different
Exactly.
times.
Yeah.
Okay, last question for us by Norman. It says, curious about thoughts on the 4-day work week model. Do you think this approach could be an effective way to reduce burnout and improve overall well-being? David, what do you think?
Yeah. So I'm very fascinated with the 4-day work week model. Part of me was hoping that we'd be there, but I don't think we're quite yet for like a lot of, let's say, the world at large. It's kind of tricky because it depends on how the model takes shape, right? There's some companies that do 4-day work week, but it's not really a 4-day work week. They'll just take those extra hours that are on the Friday and then compile them on the Monday to Thursday. So you still have 40 hours to work, right? Again, I think if you're not addressing it always comes back to the root cause, those three components, right? If you're not addressing those root causes, so if you're not feeling like you can get stuff done, I don't think having 4 days in a week is going to make it any better, especially if you shorten the hours, right? Because then you're just putting more stress on people. Some people do like to have that extra day because like I like working on Fridays because it's quieter. I could get like my thoughts out, get focus time, work on like some projects that may be delaying. But that's me. That's what works for me. Trying to put like an over kind of arching mandate for the whole company can be tricky. Same thing with like remote work. Same thing with hybrid work.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a one size fits all. It's whatever kind of makes sense for the person that's doing it. I don't know, Una, what would you want
I
to
would,
add?
I would definitely agree. I think there's companies that this model works well for, and there's companies that it doesn't.
Yeah.
And the main difference is, what does it actually take care of, right? Because it's a mechanism, right?
Yeah.
It's not a root cause. So figuring out what is causing our team to be burned out, or what could cause them, like what are we on the track towards, and then from that thinking about what are the different mechanisms versus starting at the mechanism. And Norman, obviously, you know your team more better than anyone, so you might already think, well, this might be the right mechanism, in which case it might work really, really well for you. And it just truly depends on the company, truly depends on how it's executed, right? If we expect, again, people to work 15-hour days the other 4 days, obviously it's not going to affect it.
Yeah.
I would always say start with the why. What are we trying to accomplish? And then thinking about what are the different mechanisms by which we can accomplish that. One thing that worked for me on a different team is no meeting Fridays, no meeting Mondays, like having some quiet
Love
time,
that.
and we do everything maybe asynchronously or via email kind of setting. That was just that was a setting that really worked well because people could get heads down work done on their own time, and you just learn to do social stuff and meetings in the other 3 days.
Love that.
David, we're almost at time. We had so many different questions, so I just want to be respectful of people's full hour that they contributed and joined us. David and I are going to hang on for a few more minutes. So if you have thoughts or questions, feel free to stay on, drop them in the chat. But we just wanted to thank you for being here and for truly sharing your stories. We only know a sliver of it, right? You're working with your teams every single day dealing with these questions. So a lot of the value is just you sharing for everyone else to see what has worked or hasn't worked for you. David, anything else?
Just thank you for your time. I'm glad you guys enjoyed this. The one thing I will mention is you have to give us time for the webinar recording. I noticed in the practice session, it takes, because the video file is so long, Zoho takes a while, but you will get it hopefully within a day or so. So don't worry if you don't get an email right away. But yeah, and if you have any questions whatsoever, want to talk burnout, want to talk vacation tracker or HeyTaco, you see our emails are on the slide right here. Feel free to reach us, even just to say hello. You know, just it's nice to hear from people. So don't be shy.
Thank you all. Let us know if anything comes up here in the chat. We'll be online for a few more minutes, and have a nice evening, especially to people who joined us while preparing their dinner or after dinner. That's true commitment. Hope
Love that.
you got what you were hoping to get out of this conversation.